A few months ago, I was having a conversation with a colleague at Yale Divinity School, which is where I spend my other quarter time of work when I'm not here. And I confided in her that since the pandemic, I had been rethinking the high value I used to place on my ability to multitask. I am a definite multitasker. Anybody else in the room likes to multitask? Pretty important to you all? Yeah, okay. Indeed, I find that it's a necessity in someone who holds 3 jobs, 2 of them ministry-related, a doctoral program, having a spouse to support, and children to raise and attend to. With what I hold, multitasking is a really important skill. But what I was questioning with my colleague was not the need to multitask, but the value I used to place on it. Before the pandemic, I was very, very proud of my ability to do this. It felt holy in a way to be so committed to everything, just so dedicated. But in the past few years, I said to my colleague, it all has shifted. I still need to multitask, of course, but more than that, I felt the need to be present. Present to my kids on Zoom schooling, present to my then new church 3 years ago as they grieved the loss of, in-person everything. Present to my Yale folks, helping them with resources as the youth ministry landscape changed suddenly and for forever. And then I said to my colleague, presence mattered so much more in that time than multitasking did. I don't want to lose that. My colleague with whom I was sharing all this agreed. Yeah, she said, multitasking isn't what it used to be. My brain doesn't actually like it anymore. Now, it's more about how we carry what we have to hold. My brain doesn't like multitasking anymore. Now it's more about how we carry what we have to hold. I see that when I look at our text for this morning. This is a jumble of a text, which can look a little bit like a bunch of disparate chunks of story kind of thrown together. So I'm going to read it again, which I almost never do with this group, but I'm going to read it again, and as I do that, I want you all to pay attention to the number of people or groups that Jesus interacts with, okay? So start a mental tally as you hear me read this, the number of people or groups that Jesus has to tend to. Okay, here goes. As Jesus was walking along, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth. He said to him, "Follow me." He got up and followed him. And as he sat at dinner in the house, many tax collectors and sinners came and were sitting with him and his disciples. And when the Pharisees saw this, they said to the disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" But when Jesus heard this, he said, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, for I have come not to call the righteous, but the sinners." While he was saying these things to them, suddenly a leader of the synagogue came in and knelt before him, saying, "My daughter has just died, but come and lay your hand on her, she will live." So Jesus got up and followed him with his disciples. Then suddenly a woman who'd been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years came up behind him and touched the fringe of his cloak, for she said to herself, "If I only touch his cloak, I will be made well." Jesus turned. Seeing her, he said, "Take heart, daughter, your faith has made you well." And instantly the woman was made well. When Jesus came to the leader's house, he saw the flute players and a crowd making a commotion. He said, "Go away, for the girl is not dead but sleeping," and they laughed at him. But when the crowd had been put outside, he went in, took her by the hand, and the girl got up. And the report of this spread throughout the district. Okay, how many did you all get of the people and crowds? 9, 10? Okay, yeah. Let's look through this, and we'll talk about the substance in a minute, but just counting these interactions. So we have Jesus asking Matthew to follow him, right? Then he has dinner with a whole group of tax collectors and sinners. The Pharisees are there too. Then we have this leader of the synagogue who takes him away to help his daughter. Then the woman with the 12-year bleeding issue grabs him, literally. Then the crowd at the leader's house, including flute players, which, by the way, was a common custom at deaths. It's a sign of mourning and lament for that culture. So then the girl whom he raises from the dead. I mean, there are a lot here. So 9, 10, sounds about right. In just a few very short verses. One day, a portion of a day even. And they're all compressed together. It really feels like a very full few hours for Jesus. So let's think about all that Jesus is called to hold here. The story starts that he is recruiting a leader for his ministry. Then he has some fellowship time with people who seem to kind of come out of nowhere. At least he has a moment to grab food. That's good. But that's interrupted by some grumbling, so it turns into a teaching moment. Then the text says that literally as he is teaching, the synagogue leader shows up. It's a pastoral emergency. Jesus is needed. While he's on the way to tend to that, another injured woman interrupts his cadence, so he tends to her. When he arrives at the synagogue leader's home, another group of people tries to stop him with the news that she's dead. He still goes. He raises the girl, which prompts more responses from the gathered crowd. That is a full day of ministry right there. Recruitment of leaders, food fellowship, teaching, standing up against adversaries, pastoral visits, and healing someone from the dead. So the multitasking that Jesus has to do here is enough to give someone total whiplash, right? Now, most of the time, the Revised Common Lectionary gives us one story to hone in on. I've preached on the woman with the 12-year bleeding issue multiple times. I've preached on Jairus and his daughter multiple times. We preach on Jesus' teachings, and we pull out a few sentences that speak to us. These are the ways we tend to preach and learn together, by looking at one story. But today, the Revised Common Lectionary, which is the assigned readings that we have and usually follow, mashes it all together. So I thought that was really interesting, and I think there might be a story there. Beloved of God, without tooting my own horn, as I read and pondered this passage and this sermon this week, I confess that I felt such deep solidarity for Jesus, so much so that truly I sat at my desk and I was brought to tears. My multitasking game is really strong, but it was tested this week. Coming back from having been away is always a challenge, but this week saw me running at a really good clip. So here's a partial list. Recruiting leaders and creating a proposed timeline for that group with the goal of interviewing and hiring a church consultant for us. Having my first week of doctoral classes, writing my first couple of papers, reading at least one book, closer to 2 at this point since I wrote this. Amassing historical documents for our church, for both one of my classes and for the Yale Reimagining Church program. So that involves some intense conversations and pouring through like decades-old pieces of paper, which was very cool, but busy. Writing something about our church for that program, which is now going on their website, along with some pictures of the place. Doing some long-range planning for worship and Christian education for the next several months for us. Having 3 pretty intensive pastoral visits and counseling sessions with various folks from the church. Meeting with a family to prepare for a funeral. Meeting with the deacons this week with our officers to prepare for council next week. Yale was also really interesting. I'm working to finalize our lineup of speakers for the fall, so I had some appointments for that. And we're in the process of creating a certificate program in Christian leadership for the 2024 to 2025 school year. So I got a chance to meet with my boss and my boss's boss and the dean of the Div School to go over the proposed course syllabus, which I've spent months working on, and solicit feedback from that meeting, which will be very substantive and add a lot more to my plate. And on a personal note, this week saw the end of the year school stuff for the boys. So this required multiple trips to the school for celebrations. I had to call my dentist for the 3rd time because a filling she fixed is still causing me a fair bit of pain a month later. An old and dear friend of mine was diagnosed with a very virulent and serious cancer. Our dear kittens both had their appointments to get fixed this week, and Zach graduated from elementary school on Friday. So, you know, it's been a week, and there are times when our schedule can keep up, but our body can't. There's a reason I've lost my voice and have been not feeling well. Now, please hear me clearly. I share this list without a single ounce of inner pride about it. Pre-pandemic, it would have been, yay, look at me, look at all I can do, my multitasking talent. No, this list is actually deeply confessional to you all today. It always feels a bit shameful to me when my calendar starts to look like this, because I try very hard not to let this actually happen. God has worked within me in this way such that I now have become truly allergic to being this busy because I know how hard it is to remain spiritually centered and whole in the midst of such weeks. And so for me, this kind of week is honestly unusual. But when circumstances align such that weeks like this happen, and when days like Jesus's happen in our scripture passage for today, it's not about taking pride in the multitasking. And it's actually not about shame either. It's about knowing how to carry what we have to hold. So I am heartened when I read this passage and think, Jesus gets it. Without seeking any of this out, Jesus had days like this too. Charles Hummel, the past president of Barrington College and former director of InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, is known for coining the phrase, the tyranny of the urgent. Has anyone heard this phrase before? I'm seeing some nods. The tyranny of the urgent. He writes this: your greatest danger is letting the urgent things crowd out the important things. And while InterVarsity Christian Fellowship and I do not see eye to eye theologically, I think Hummel was right here. As we see in Matthew 9, Jesus is able to do it. He is able to multitask. He pivots seamlessly, it seems, from Matthew's call to the dinner party of tax collectors and Pharisees alike, to the synagogue leader, to the bleeding woman on the street, to the flautists and the crowd of mourners, to the leader's daughter. He sees them all, and he provides for their needs. It's less about multitasking what feels urgent. It's more about knowing how to be present to what is important, carrying lightly what we have to hold. I don't think Jesus was marking off a to-do list with all of these pastoral interactions. He was carrying these people. And I think that's really important. He was carrying them without clinging to them too closely. Jesus didn't hesitate to leave the dinner to tend to the girl who had died. He didn't hesitate also to stop on his way to the girl to tend to the bleeding woman. Nor did he say to any of these people, I really need to get back to Matthew. He needs me right now because I just called him to follow me and I'm responsible for that and he doesn't know what he's doing, the poor guy. Jesus carries them always, but he also lets them go when he needs to. We're prone to clinging, I think. We're prone to seeing a way to improve things and trying to drive that home. We're committed, we're called to hold things. But I wonder, how tightly do we hold such things? Square peg, round hole, no problem. I'm going to drive that in because it's my call. But the real way Jesus calls us to here in this passage is to know what it is to carry something, to know how to hold it, and to know when to let it go. That's the crux of this passage, folks. Jesus is immediately attentive, always. And he trusts that his attentiveness and his presence is enough. He doesn't need to carry all of the things all of the time. God does that. He, Jesus, was simply called to carry some of this, some of the time, some of these people, some of the way. This brings up a very important point in ministry that my spirit has hearkened back to over and over again. God actually does not need me to do ministry. We forget that. God does not need me to do ministry. God could certainly do ministry without Jill Olds. God chooses to use me to do ministry. God did not need Jesus to stick with that dinner party until the wee hours of the morning, when the conversation could have continued on, driving points home, square peg, round hole. Nor did God need Jesus to teach Matthew all that he needed to know right then. Tyranny of the urgent. Those things might have felt urgent, but something else was more important. Jesus' deep discernment, seen over and over in the scriptures, allowed him to trust that what was most needful was what God was placing in front of him right in the present moment. Not multitasking, but presence. So, beloved of God, I hope the same for you. In absurdly busy seasons, may we take heart in remembering that Jesus gets it too, And may we remember that our identity, again, is not in what we do. It is in who we are. May we carry that knowledge. May we cling to that more closely than anything we do. And may we always seek out that holy presence. And when you feel like you might just be holding a little bit too much, may you remember that you do not carry these things alone. It's okay to pivot and to say to God, hey, can I get a lift? The answer, beloved, will always be yes. In the name of God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit.